Thursday, April 15th, 2021, formerly known as Tax Day, but because the deadline for submitting your federal and state income tax has been moved due to COVID, it's not Tax Day today, but it's April 15th. On Thursdays here on the Vote Common Good podcast, we take a look at some issues that matter in our society. And today I'm by myself in the podcast chair, sitting down today in Minneapolis. So if you're following along on the social streams and have a chance to comment, I'd love to hear where you are, where you're coming from, what it is that you're doing. So please let me know right there. On each of our days, we invite you to take an open-eyed view of the world that we live in, to see it clearly, and then to approach it with some hope, as we like to say around Vote Common Good, with a little faith, hope, and love for a change in America. And to consider issues that matter to us. And today it matters that we're going to be talking, an issue that matters is talking about policing, about militarization, and the increasing story of violence in the United States of America. So we're going to spend our time today not in a dialogue like we do almost every other day. Almost every other day there's a co-host, there's a guest, there's someone. It's a dialogical style, conversational style of podcast. But today it's a monologue. Now, if you throw something up in the comment sections, if you're watching on the social streams, I'd be glad to address those as we go. But I chose to take this topic on myself today. It matters a lot to me. As some of you know, if you've been listening to this podcast over these weeks, I am in Minneapolis, and our city has become the center of an awful lot of conversation around policing and the way that the police force is often applied inappropriately and disproportionately to the Black community, to the indigenous community, and to other people of brown skin. And it's true, in my view. I think it's provable by the facts that this is the case. So we're going to talk about that. But we're also going to talk about the increased militarization of the United States of America. I mean across the board, not just in policing. The increase in militarization shows up all over, shows up at our airports. It shows up on our streets. It shows up in our policing, of course. It shows up in our generalized culture. In fact, we have this story afoot that our soldiers should be honored and cared for. Now, that may be true, that we want to thank people for being in the military. But in my view, something is a bit out of whack when only one part of our society's commitment to giving themselves to the betterment of others is heralded. I'm not saying we shouldn't thank soldiers for their work. Sure, if that's meaningful for you, you should thank them. Should also thank other people. We should thank school teachers. We should thank civic officials. We should thank our sanitation people. We should be more thankful for everybody for the work that they do. There's something, when you're going to get on an airplane, something to me odd about the fact that when the seating is happening, they say, if you're a current military member, you get on first. Now look, I get it. We want to be thoughtful. This country's dealing with its own history out of Vietnam, where soldiers were treated worse when they got home, and they were drafted. But there's something going on where there's a militarization of our society. I only bring up that issue of talking about how we talk about people that are in the military, thanking them for their service, giving them extra bonuses and all, because we have this broken relationship with our military. We feel like we don't treat them well enough, and so then we give them all kinds of accommodations. But I think this notion that we want the military to be our leaders is a dangerous perspective. I'm not saying that people in the military shouldn't lead in our civic society. Of course they should, absolutely. No doubt that they should. But that's different than believing that it's the military that keeps us safe. And that's what translates into policing, is that our police force in the United States has become increasingly militarized. Now, I think a lot of this has happened since 2001. I think after the terror attacks of 2001 and the military response, that our country, an entire generation, of which I am centered on, my middle-aged life and my children's lives when they were 10 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old, were all impacted by these terrorist attacks. And so we told ourselves a story that we would be kept safe by our military. And so militarization, from our airports to our border to our policing to the people that are actually in the military, has increased. We have chosen to depend on and to highly esteem and to highly acclaim the military. I think it's really dangerous. I'll tell you who else agrees with that perspective. People that are in the military. They know how limited the military's capacities are. Generals will tell you this. Average soldiers will tell you this. That what people are taught to do in the military, how our combative military forces are trained, what they're asked to do, that's no way to live a life. That's no way to run a society. In fact, our military is only used, even in military conflicts, to get to a point that we can have some kind of negotiated, some kind of democratic, some kind of peace that's brought. The point of the military is not to live under military rule. Now, I'm not suggesting we're to the point of a military rule. In fact, in some places, we have too little protection from our military, like around our Capitol on January 6th, when tens of thousands of Trump supporters were allowed to ransack our Capitol in an insurrection. There we should have had more. Other times we should have less. We should have protected our Capitol on a day when we knew tens of thousands of people were there to stop the free and fair election results of the 46th president of the United States. I think we should have less of that at our airports, and we should have less of that in our police forces and less of that on our southern border. So yeah, we have some decisions to make about how we're going to deploy the military. But there is a narrative of violence that we have to resist in our nation. This has been a country that has used violence, from our own Revolutionary War to our Civil War to the violence that was used to be sure the slave community stayed in place and that they didn't become too rambunctious or too dangerous or too fleeful. All of those conversations were part of our history, and the way that the police forces and the way that private police industries have been used to incarcerate and to punish people. So if we don't take a good hard look at the overall militarization perspective in our society, I don't think we'll be able to apply this appropriately to policing. And what we'll do on a future podcast to talk about the militarization of our southern border, that we are not allowing people to interact with Health and Human Services when they're seeking refugee or asylum status, or with bureaucratic conversations about immigration, but rather met with Homeland Security, who has control of our borders. Tanks, guns, flak jackets, stun guns, grenades, this kind of thing. So the militarization of our society as a whole is something we need to consider, that we need to look at, needs to be rethought. That brings us also to policing. Policing is one of these places where the militarization in our society, in my view, is totally and completely out of control. And one of the big problems with it is that when you train up a group of people who have volunteered themselves to be in the police force, and they know it's a militarized perspective in the police force, it attracts a certain kind of candidate. One of the things I've learned in the last few years is how the process of recruiting, selecting, and approving police officers all around the country, especially here in Minnesota, where I know the situation in most detail, is the root of why we have certain kinds of people and certain kinds of profiles of people who are police officers. There's actually tests that you have to take. And those tests have a bias in them, that certain people are passed forward and certain people are not. If you've ever wondered why it is that our police forces often have less people of color to match the percentage of people of color in a city or in our state as a whole, or your state as a whole, one of the reasons is because the bias in the procedures of approval for someone to become a police officer tends to not pass on people of color at the same rate that it passes on people who are white. There's actually a systemic problem in the approval and the recruiting process. So there's people here in Minnesota who are working on this because they're recognizing that the number of applicants and then the number of people that are approved and then the number of people who can move on to be a part of a police academy or a police training program through a community college or state college, that number going from the number of applicants to the number of people in the academy weeds out, sifts out people of color disproportionately because the tests create the problem. The other thing that a militarized system does is it attracts people who want to be in a militarized system. Look, modern policing in the last 20 years has changed dramatically. I'll read some statistics and some descriptions for you here in a minute. But it has changed dramatically. So the kind of person who then says, what do I want to do with my life? How do I want to live? They're looking at a police force that has become increasingly militarized, increasingly combative, increasingly hostile to the citizenry. And if you're not experiencing police that feel aggressive and hostile to you, I would suggest that you talk to some people who feel that's the case and hear their stories, hear why they say that the police force feels as if it's a hostile force to their well-being, not a protective force for safety and for community wholeness, but as something that they need to be concerned about and afraid of. What we have is a militarized police system inside of a militarized national culture that is moving forward with the use of violence as a legitimate means of community control and engagement and order. And I would declare simply this: if we have to use violence in order to have order, then we have a disordered system. If we have to use violence in order to maintain order, then we have a disordered system. Because you cannot live in a society where the reason that we tell ourselves we have order is because we have people who will behave violently. What we need to do is to create a system by which acts of violence are occasional, are preventable, and are responded to, not where a system of violence is what is expected to maintain order. This is one of the things that so many people have been saying over and over, is that they believe that police just have to use force, they have to use violence because there's no other way to control the population. But look, one of the big myths is that the police keep our society safe or that our military keeps our country free. We are kept free in our country by negotiations, by partnerships, by cooperation with people around the world. We only use military when all of that fails, when all of that goes awry. And the military leaders will tell you we should only use the military for very specific outcomes to get us back to the point where we can live with agreements and with harmony. The same thing in our society. Maybe you heard the police chief from Brooklyn Center, which is the town where Dante Wright was killed by the police officer. And he said the next day that he was releasing the footage of that killing because he believed that it was his job to be open and to be clear, and that it was his responsibility to keep the community safe. Maybe you remember he became emotional about that. He became emotional and people made a lot out of the fact that he was having a hard time here. And they were saying, I think maybe you should consider the fact of the victim and not the fact of the police officer that had to be involved in a shooting. But I think there's something more important than that critique. And that's the notion that that police chief and so many other people believe that it's the job of the police to keep us safe. Look, we're kept safe because the citizenry acts in ways that keep us safe. This fractional number, 420,000 police officers across the entire United States system, that is not what keeps 350 million people safe. We are not kept safe by there being an armed force that's able to use violence. That's not the premise of our safety. And look, whether you're a progressive like me, or you're a libertarian like some people choose to be, or you're a conservative Republican, the last thing you believe is that our freedom is kept in place by a force of power. Our freedom and our safety comes from one another. One of the things you'll notice when protests happen, like are happening in Minneapolis now and have been happening all over the country over the course of the last year, One of the things you'll notice is how many people can turn out and the level to which the police have to ramp up because they believe that now they're going to combat. I've stood in those lines. I have stood and had the police shoot pepper spray in my own eyes. I've watched rubber bullets fly over my head while wearing a clergy collar and a shirt that says love on it, trying to get the police to not shoot rubber bullets at protesters. When you're in those kinds of situations, you recognize how outnumbered the police are. Even when the police put on their armor and they come out with their trucks and they come out with their billy clubs and they come out with their masks and helmets on, the only way order is maintained is when the people leave. If the people of the United States chose to rise up against our police forces, we would overwhelm them. Of course we would. By numbers, by morality. The whole thing about governance is that anyone in the United States who's an official, who has power that's given to the government, they're only given that power by the consent of the population. The reason the police have authority is because we give it to them. And every once in a while, somebody changes course, somebody breaks the law, somebody's lawless, and then we have a system to deal with that. But this idea that without that police force, it would be chaos is one of the myths that exists in our society that gives certain people the perspective that they should embolden the police to use any means necessary. What I'm arguing for is an entire society, what I would call a society of the common good, that does not believe that the safety of our communities is first and foremost the product of our police forces, but it's the product of our people. And when people do not trust their police force, we have disorder. So even though there's some people that want to argue for law and order, the modern day policing styles in almost every major city, every rural community, every suburban part of America is not comfortable with the direction of modern day policing. Some of this is racial. Some of this is the commitment to a narrative of redemptive violence. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it's a term that's been significant in the development of philosophy and theology, that we want to remove the notion, want to remove the myth that through violence, redemption can come. By being harsh, cruel, having a scapegoat, a sacrificial narrative, all of that is understood to be a myth to produce the kind of outcome that brings about safety. This is the fundamental struggle on which the racial bias of our policing, the militarization of our policing, the violence inside of our policing exists. Now, it's not only people, again, like me, who are saying this. I was surprised to find out that when I did some research on the militarization of the police, and I found this really great article. And when I clicked on it, it became clear that this was produced by the Charles Koch Foundation. Now, that name might not mean anything to you, but maybe if I said the word the Koch brothers, K-O-C-H brothers, you would understand who they are. So the Koch brothers are these big Republican, almost libertarian-leaning funders that if you're in the political world like I am, you would understand the Koch brothers to be part of, the dark cabal of money that's perpetuating certain Republicans. And a lot of people have pushed against the Koch brothers. So I end up in this article put together by the Charles Koch Foundation calling for reform in policing. And it's an excellent article about the militarization of the police and what a hazard it is. How much pain it caused, how it's the wrong perspective to have, how we need to demilitarize the police. This was from 2015, this article. I'm going to show you a short 60-second video here for you to watch if you're watching on the video stream, and to hear if you're on the podcast. They produce these 60-second videos to try to help people understand the problem with modern day policing and where it's gone and why people shouldn't trust it anymore with some animation. So even groups like the Koch brothers and Charles Koch Foundation are making the argument that to militarize our police so that they can affect violence to try to control the society does not bring about a drop in crime. It does not bring about a safer society. It does not treat all citizens or perpetrators in a way that we should accept in this society. Okay, so I'm going to play the 60-second video for you, and then I've got some details for you that come from this article here in a bit.
This is policing in 60 seconds. The police are the public, and the public are the police. That's from Robert Peel, who helped create modern policing in the 1800s. Sure, the world was different then, but Peel tapped into something that's necessary for effective policing: trust and accountability. But the US has gotten further away from police officers who know their communities and whom their neighbors trust. Rising crime in the 1970s and 80s led to some aggressive reforms that were supposed to keep police safer. But now, police have access to equipment used in war zones, like mine-resistant tanks, and SWAT teams conduct 50 to 80,000 raids each year. These things don't necessarily make police or communities safer. People should feel comfortable asking a police officer for help, but seeing an officer armed to the teeth doesn't build trust. There's ways for police to return to being peace officers. Ending the federal 1033 program that gives local departments surplus military gear might be a good first step. And different policing practices, like encouraging foot patrols, would allow police to get to know residents and become familiar faces in the communities they help.
So there's the Charles Koch Foundation Institute saying, hey, you know what we need to do? Demilitarize the police. Now their history of policing doesn't just go back to 1868 where it was let's police by the governed. The history of policing in the United States is derivative from slave patrols. That was the first organized policing in the United States to capture runaway slaves from slave states and return them. And then that was transitioned into being sure that freed slaves didn't become a criminal element, because once they were freed as slaves, the fear was they wouldn't have jobs and they would have to turn to crime because they're people that didn't have the morals to be upstanding citizens. So there's a racial history that is continued from slave patrols right through April 15th, 2021 in the United States. No doubt about that. But this critique that the militarization of the police has created a crisis is something that I think is worth focusing on. And I'm glad the Koch brothers, or at least Charles Koch, is in agreement with that. I hope that many other people are as well. I want to give you a little definition here. I'm going to read it for you of what police militarization is and how it's understood. It's defined by scholars, and people actually study this. And I'll put the link in the show notes for those of you on the audio, and put it up in the stream here after we're done. It's the process so the militarization of police is the process whereby civilian police increasingly draw from a pattern themselves. I'm going to start reading that again. I paused at the wrong place. The militarization of the police is the process whereby civilian police increasingly draw from and pattern themselves around the tenets of militarism and the military model. This process tangibly occurs when a civilian police force adopts the equipment, the operational tactics, mindsets, and culture of the military. Look, this is one of the things that has happened in modern day policing, really since 2000. First, after the huge buildup in 2000 of weapons to be used in war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. That equipment then needed to be moved somewhere because it got old, because there was surplus. So what the federal government said, and what was referred to in that video as the 1033 Law 1033, was that police forces in the United States could acquire for free that military equipment. So the actual equipment itself, tanks, rocket launchers, Humvees, the kinds of things that you'll see in the videos of the police coming out around street protests, all of those kinds of weapons, armored vehicles, even aircraft, comes from this 1033 program where the federal government would move the equipment from the military into police forces. Well, so imagine what has to happen when you do that. You have to then train people on how to think about and how to use and how to deploy military weapon assets. So what do police forces do? They bring in people from the military to train on how to use this equipment. And this is what started the engine of seeing our local police as a force that has military capacity. The argument given is, well, the drug cartels, the organized crime, they carry this same kind of equipment. So people have been studying this. They've been studying this over the last 2 decades. Is that true? As it turns out, almost no military equipment has been used in any drug enforcement against any cartel in any situations. Do you know when most of it's been used? To clear the streets around street protests. The only time in the city of Minneapolis and surrounding suburbs that the police forces have put on their armored gear, pulled out their Humvees, put on their military garb. The 2 instances where that happens are all the street protests, which have always been protesting police violence, and when the RNC convention came to Minneapolis, the Republican National Convention back in 2007. That's when. Didn't have to use it. There wasn't anything, but they were out in force to make sure that everything looked safe. And occasionally, around the Super Bowl, they would throw a little bit of it. But when it really comes out in force, it's to respond to citizens responding to police killings. The actual use of this militarized force is to respond to people who are protesting police violence. Do you see the cycle? This is part of what makes it so insidious, is that the need for it is that someone's throwing a water bottle or shooting a bottle rocket or throwing a brick over a fence. Well, when have those things happened? After the police have killed someone and the citizenry responds to say, we need to raise attention, scream our voices, shout from the rocks so the rocks don't shout out, and make it clear that we're not going to stand for this kind of treatment any longer. So the very aggressive behavior of the police and the response of the citizenry is what brings out the militarization. So that's how the weaponry is used. But it's the mindset, it's the mentality that has gone on to create this circumstance. I want to read you a bit more from this article. The program, which is called the 1033 program, has become something of interest to a lot of people, and people have turned against it. So public awareness and coverage of police militarization has largely focused on the acquisition of military equipment by police, such as armored vehicles, aircrafts, and other weapons. Since the early 1990s, the Defense Department's 1033 program has provided local law enforcement agencies access to military-grade equipment. But that really took an uptick after the 2001, 2002, and 2003. That program was then expanded by Donald Trump after President Obama attempted to limit its use, allowing law enforcement agencies to receive excess Defense Department equipment that would otherwise be destroyed because it was no longer useful to the military. Over 8,000 law enforcement agencies have utilized the 1033 program to access more than $6 billion worth of military equipment, including night vision goggles, machine guns, armored vehicles, bayonets, grenade launchers, and military aircraft. Other items that can be accessed by local law enforcement agencies through the program include field packs, canteens, sleeping bags, and ponchos. The increased use of military equipment has coincided with an increase of military tactics. This is where I think the real power in these facts lie, such as SWAT teams, no-knock raids by law enforcement agencies, and other aggressive practices. In recent years, police departments from Ferguson to Charlotte to Southampton have received criticism for their use of military tactics. One study found that the use of paramilitary-style teams by law enforcement increased more than 1,400% since 1980. Basically, what we've done is we have increased SWAT teams, rapid response teams that are armed to the hilt. Even your local police officer carries more lethality on her body than at any time in history. So much so that when Dante Wright was killed by that police officer, she had to choose which weapon she was going to use, the taser or her gun. Then you know why she chose her gun. It's what she was trained to do. The amount of training she has received, the amount of time she has been at shooting galleries, the amount of time she has fired that weapon in training compared to the amount of time that any police officer uses their taser is a multiple of times. Police officers will tell you they're trained to use their taser, but they're not drilled on it. They don't use it all the time. Apparently, they're expensive. When you fire those tasers, then they have to be replaced and put back together, so they don't actually use them in real training situations. But do they go to the gun range? You better believe they go to the gun range. And they learn how to shoot, and they learn how to use night goggles, and they learn how to militarize, and they learn how to move in a military pattern. And look, friends, we are not talking about the National Guard. We're not talking about the fact that every state actually has what the Second Amendment refers to as a well-trained and well-governed militia called the National Guard, which sits under the authority of the governor. Our states already have in-state military forces. But did you know that those military forces are not supposed to be deployed against our own citizens? They're supposed to protect our citizens. The police, on the other hand, they're not restricted from using the same military tactics and the same military weaponry that the National Guard has. The need for police reform that roots from the racist narrative in this country, that roots from the fear of criminals, that roots from the myth that it's the police that keep us safe. The reason the reform has to be so deep is because it has become so lethal. It is so dangerous. You may have your own story of having been on the blunt end of the violent police tactics. I certainly have, whether it's been in protest situations, demonstrations, been zip-tied. I've also had an instant where I was in a situation and was at a mall to get a knife sharpened and had the knife out of a bag in my hand while I was waiting to go in the store, finishing up a phone call, and a police officer came up and drew his weapon, pointed it at my head, told me to get on the ground. I did. I got on the ground, and he pushed me to the ground, put his knee in the middle of my back, lifted me up multiple times, and smashed my face into the ground, handcuffed me, violently lifted me up again, threw me up against a wall. I'm not a police officer. I don't know if that's how they're trained. But I'll tell you this, that's how they act. And watching the Derek Chauvin trial this week, to hear the defense come out and say from their witnesses that what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd, totally appropriate. It's what we should do. It's what we're trained to do. Now, there's other police officers that testified, no, it's not at all what we should do. That's not how it goes. That's not how it should function. So there's a debate inside policing about how we should behave. There's no doubt about that. This is not just, those outside the police force from those inside the police force having these arguments. This is all over our society. This is happening in, family rooms and at restaurants and in bars. People having these conversations. It's certainly happening in churches, I hope. Pastors, if there's pastors who listen, why don't you raise this issue and talk about it in your community? Ask people to tell their stories of policing. There's some stories where police have done heroic things for people. And in very few of those circumstances, was it with the force of lethality? Was it with violence? Was it with shouting commands? Was it with apprehensions? There's an entire perspective that has come from the military that now is on our streets. Just yesterday, I was just down the road from here and was driving and had to pull over because a Minneapolis police squad was leading a caravan of National Guard trucks rolling into another part of Minneapolis where I was headed. If you're in a city where you've seen the militarization of your streets, where curfews have been called, where the police are out in force, where there's military around, you understand that we have this capacity and it's being used and it's being utilized. If we're going to reconsider policing and policing policies and who gets pulled over and who has charges brought and what those criminal charges should have as sentencing, if we're going to look at sentencing reform in the justice system, if we're going to look at who's being put in jail, all of that we have to look at. And we have to look at all of it through the lens of the violence and the militarization and the myth that if we use violence, that will keep us safe. So if we can put people into prisons where they're punished rather than a prison that's built around restoration and retribution, or one that's built around retribution rather than restoration. If we believe that that's the story that we should live in this country and that we would be overwhelmed by hordes of danger without the acts of violence and without punishing criminals, then we're going to continue to live in the kind of world that we have right now. One in which the trust in the police has declined to the lowest level in the history of this country. In every group. This is what I found in this research. Every group of every age has less trust in our police and policing in America than at any other time. Simply put, it is not working. It doesn't work. So some people say defund the police because they want the funding moved away from the police. Because even though you get this equipment for free from the federal government, you know what you have to do? You have to train to use it. That's expensive. You have to keep it in working order, extremely expensive. And what's even worse, according to the rules of the 1033 program, you have to use it. The 1033 program mandates that if a police force takes equipment from the federal government and they don't use it within the first year, they have to give it back. There's an incentive to use it. Now, that could be changed. I know there's people working on changing that. The incentives and the cost and all that goes into this is creating a context in which not only do the biases of police officers exist, but they're given weapons and they're given immunity. They're given the power by the citizenry that they can respond however they need to respond, and people will follow the orders of a police officer. You've seen it in the riots if you've been watching on CNN or on the news or on social media. police will come out and say, we're now telling you you have to leave. And because they tell you something, you then have to do it. The order of a police officer is an act of law. That's what we give to police officers. And then we load them to the hilt with military weaponry and a mentality that the streets of our cities are a battlefield. In the city of Brooklyn Center, where Dante Wright was killed, an analysis that was presented to the city council last year found that individuals who were stopped by the Brooklyn Center Police Department from June of 2019 to August of 2020, a year ago, over the course of a year, that individuals stopped by the police in that city over that year, 62% of those people who were stopped were black. 25% of those stopped by the police were white. Only 27% of the Brooklyn Center residents are black. 38.3% are white. So of a population of its 20%, 27% black, 62% of the traffic stops from the police were people who are black. Just random statistics would tell you that's twice as many, that's twice as likely to be pulled over than the population. Population's 27%. Pullover rate 62%. Pullovers are used to control a population. Look, Dante Wright had a warrant out, a bench warrant out for a misdemeanor for carrying a weapon without a permit, which some gun rights people are jumping on to say, hey, you shouldn't have to have a permit in the first place. But he had a violation. So when they looked and saw that his tabs on his license plate were expired, and just so you know, in Minnesota, the way that that works is on one side, you have a little sticker that has the month, and on the other side of the license plate, the right side, you have a little sticker that's the year. So it would say April of 2021, which tells you that your tabs expire in April of 2021. And it's a different color for the year. The month stays the same and the year changes out. So police officers can see very quickly to see if, are we in this year or last year, right? So they can see without reading the numbers, they can say, oh, it's supposed to be orange and it's, blue. So that tells me that this car is likely driving with an expired tab. So they pull him over and they see that he's got something hanging from his rearview mirror, which is also a code violation for driving. Look, that's a pretext for pulling people over. That's why we do it that way. Many of our highways here in Minnesota, maybe it's the same in the cities and states where you live, they don't pull as many people over now for speeding. What they do is use cameras. And they use cameras that clock your speed, and then it takes a photo of your driver's license. Then they mail you a ticket. Because it's dangerous to pull people over on highways. But on side streets, it's a great chance to check and see what's going on in the car. Where are you going? What are you up to? Where do you find yourself? By the way, you don't have to answer any of those questions to a police officer. It's not their business where you're going. You can ask if you're being detained. If you're being detained, you can say, I want a lawyer, and you don't have to say a word. You have the right to remain silent. You don't have to say anything to them. But none of us do that. You know why? Because we try to work with the police. So they come up to the car and they say, do you know how fast you're going? Do you know, tell me where you're going. What are you up to? What have you been doing today? And we engage with them, right? Because we're trying to not just invoke our rights. We're trying to be decent people. But so many people's experience with the police is that they're not asking those questions simply to check in on you, make sure you haven't been drinking, trying to see if you can slur your word, if you're slurring your words, or if you can follow a sentence and maintain eye contact. No, they're just looking around, seeing if there's another reason. Went out to my wife's car and looked at the back of it, at the license plate, about a week and a half ago. Tabs have been expired for 6 months. We're 6 months late. Should have been updated. So I came in, got online, paid the $114. They sent me new tabs. Got me asking a question. If I can renew my Netflix account every month with an auto pay, why can't the state of Minnesota come up with a way where I could say, when my tabs expire, use the same bank account or credit card I used last time and send me new tabs? Let's go ahead and just make that an automated practice of re-upping my tabs. Why is it that I have to log on to a website or walk into a DMV and have to go through this whole engagement to get my new tabs to drive? Why don't we do that? Or why don't we just take pictures like we do when someone's speeding if their tabs are expired and send them a fine? Or when they go to renew their tabs, you add on the penalty at that point because they were caught not updating their tabs on time. Why don't we find another way than pulling people over? You know why? Because the police want to pull people over. It's one of the mechanisms that they use. So in states, in cities, in counties where they've done police reform, one of the reforms is stop using these traffic stops as a means of engaging with the citizenry. Don't pull people over for this. Find another mechanism. Look, we can figure out how to get the Minneapolis police force an armored vehicle and figure out how to pay to maintain that thing. And we can't figure out how to re-up our tabs for our license plates in a manner that don't get people pulled over. So what's happening in our policing is that it's being used, things that sound reasonable to people, traffic violations, taillights being out, didn't use your blinker, all of this. These are all designed partly to enforce proper behavior, right? You want to teach people to pay their license fee tabs, to use their blinker when they go, to drive with their headlights on, all this kind of thing. There's ways to do this that don't involve having an armed police officer with a taser on one hip and a Glock on the other hip and pepper spray and a nightstick and a shotgun in their car and two officers coming up on either side of your car and asking you to get out and where you're going. This kind of responsive policing, this is what people who are saying something in addition to defund the police is, let's not just spend all the money to maintain all the riot and all the militarization of the police, but let's have a different approach of the police. The Koch brothers even said, get out of your car, walk your streets, meet your neighbors, approach people as if your job is is not simply to be keeping people safe through the use of violence. To have a peacekeeping force, a peace officer, an officer of the peace, rather than a policing officer that's militarized. I could hear my wife right now saying, could you stop yelling? Yes, I think I could stop yelling. I'm going to put a couple of these comments here up on the screen and see. I'm flying solo today, so sorry, Cynthia, I got to move this thing out of the way. There was a time recently when police force all over the country were actively recruiting returning vets. They've realized that they've been taught to show force and yes, kill, and they can't let go of that. It's a great point, Cynthia. I've heard that too, that the population of local police have been populated by military. So it's much easier to just bring in somebody in the military than it is to, militarize people that wanted to be a peace officer. All right. Well, here's 1699 Stu. Criminals must be stopped and arrested if they've committed a crime, but in no way, I think that's what it should they lose their life in that act. Yeah. Yes. Stu, look, yeah. Do criminals need to be arrested and apprehended? Yeah, we can't have a society of lawlessness. Can we prioritize what we mean by a law that's going to be enforced by the police? what's an arrestable act versus what's a civil penalty. Our police code, our law code, our criminal law code, it's enormous. It's complicated. If some of you are wondering why the officer that shot Dante Wright is being charged with second-degree manslaughter, and you're like, what's the difference between second-degree manslaughter and, I don't know, first-degree manslaughter or third-degree murder or first-degree murder? Like, just in the killing of people, we have many categories of crimes. Every crime is like that. Our statutes are robust, to say it simply. But how we decide what's going to be arrested first, the discretion of a police officer for who they're going to pull over. My friend lives across the street, was pulled over by the police for too quickly moving from one lane onto another lane to get onto a highway, and he kind of cut across two lanes and was pulled over, and the officer's like, whoa, what was that? What was that move? White guy. And, he talked to the officer, and the officer said, hey, just drive a little more carefully, and so on. He gets home, gets out of the car, looks. His tabs are expired by 3 months at the time. This guy was pulled over by the police for how he drove, let go, didn't even mention the tabs. This was like 4 weeks ago in Minneapolis. The discretion police officers have to not even say anything to my neighbor, to not pull over our car. We're the number of police that saw our car in the 6 months that we had expired tabs. Or to pull a guy over because he has expired tabs. So yeah, we have to arrest criminals. Some of you know that's why I think Donald Trump should go to jail. But I don't think we have to apply this to every single traffic or civic infraction. But look, I'm no genius here. I'm not coming up with a new theory of policing that is, no one's ever heard of. The police chiefs, the police officers know why they pull people over for expired tabs or for rolling through a stop sign or for darkened windows or for things hanging on their rearview mirrors or for whatever manner of rationale. They want to see what's going on in the car. Where are you going? Now, sometimes they're pulling people over to give them speeding tickets because we have a perverse level of incentive for people to be pulled over and have to pay for policing by being fined. Thanks, low tax advocates. Great idea. Let's make traffic a user fee by issuing tickets to people. So, $16.99 Stu. Yes, there's a lot of thought that has to go in on who should get arrested. Mark Collins says 1033 is part of a resource flow chart from product replacement early in the lifespan of the product. Market capitalism anchors recycling, or authors recycling, abhors recycling, pardon me. Market capitalism abhors recycling. All right. James has a comment here. James Howard says, no armed agent of the state should have the power of collective bargaining on any issue of use of force. Boy, James. And the picture is him in a military piece. So, James, I'd love to hear more about your thought about all this, too. James makes a great point. What he's getting at here, if this comment makes sense to you, you already know this. If not, that collective bargaining is part of what the police unions have put together to protect police officers from being held criminally responsible for their actions as a police officer. It's a thorny issue for a lot of people. Unions try to work on behalf and negotiate a contract that's going to benefit their employees. This is true of teachers unions. It's true of packing unions. It's true of trucking unions. It's true of police unions. And the police union has argued that a police officer cannot do her job if she thinks she's going to be held sued if someone says that she has violated their rights. So there's this immunity that's given to them that comes out of collective bargaining. And the federal government is trying to remove this immunity for police officers so that they can be charged. So that's one way to get there. I think back to Mark's comments about capitalism. And one of the solutions I've heard to this idea is that every police officer should have to carry personal insurance the way a doctor does. See, a doctor has to carry malpractice insurance. And if there's enough cases brought against the doctor, their malpractice insurance rates go through the roof and they can't stay in practice because the insurance industry won't insure them. If every police officer had to carry personal conduct insurance and an insurance criteria was brought to bear on whether this officer was insurable or not, instead of the police unions and collective bargaining putting officers who have claims and charges against them, fired police officers being brought back onto the forces, and then the city of Minneapolis paying out $10 million to Justine Ruchek, I think it was, and $27 million to the Floyd family, and Brooklyn Center will have to pay tens of millions of dollars in the civil lawsuit. The city will have to pay that. The police officer can't be sued. The city can. In other words, our civic bank accounts will pay for it. They won't. Now, would that be a fair way to go? That's a very interesting argument. So, okay, one more thought from Tony lives in Brazil. It was saying so true about something. You don't know what it was. Fantastic idea. I live in Brazil, but I'm American. Too much police violence all over the world. The U.S. should be leading the way on this new approach. It seems to me that we should. But what the United States has actually done is led the rest of the world in how to militarize our police force. People from other countries come to the United States to see what our local police forces have done to integrate the militarization mindset. Look, all of us deal with grief in different ways. Policing grieves me. The militarization of our society grieves me. The story of violence in our country drives me bananas. The stories we tell ourselves about what keep us safe. So I want to talk about it for an hour. But we have to actually pass new laws, have new approaches, do new trainings, train our police officers on how to deal with the trauma that exists in them every day. I'll tell you this. You talk to somebody that's been in the battlefield as a military member, they'll tell you about the emotional, psychological, physical trauma that is. You militarize police forces and send them out every day into the battlefield. Damage it does to those officers. One of the shootings in Minnesota was by a rookie cop. People said, well, he's a rookie. That explains it. The killing of Dante Wright was by a 26-year veteran who trains other officers and was in that very day was training a rookie. And then people are saying the years of compounding trauma made her reflexively grab her revolver rather than her taser. So which is it? That you're not trained or that you've been around it too long? You know what it tells me? No matter if you're new or you've been at it for half of a lifetime, putting this level of weaponry and this mentality of control and dominance and response is a huge part of where the problem lies. I don't know how you deal with your grief around these issues. Today is the day that the defense is going to close their defense arguments in the Derek Chauvin trial. Just before I started this podcast, Derek Chauvin said he was not going to speak in his own defense. He was going to use his Fifth Amendment, which he has every right to use. And we should all be reminded that when someone uses their Fifth Amendment, the right to not incriminate themselves, that doesn't mean they're guilty of anything. He's guilty because of his actions. He's guilty because of his knee on George Floyd's neck. He's guilty because of his indifference to life. He's guilty because he used his body weight to bring an end to a man's life, all because he had the authority of a police officer. Look, if that crowd had been around and anybody else was sitting on George Floyd's neck, they would have ran over and knocked him off. Why didn't they? Because we defer to our police. Why did George Floyd lay there and say, I'm going to do what you say, I'm going to do what you say? Because, not because he had handcuffs on, because he deferred to the police and they killed him. This is why people don't do what the police tell them to do in all the situations where you want them to do what the police tell you to do. Because we don't trust the police departments and police officers in our society at the highest rate in the history of this country. Some of us because of personal experience and some of us because of empathic response to what we've seen in the lives of others. So we're all living in the midst of this. This pressure is building. What's going to happen in this trial? How are these 12 citizens of Hennepin County going to rule in this case of Derek Chauvin? I sure hope he's guilty, found guilty. If he is, it doesn't solve all these problems. It's the right thing to do, and we should do it. And then we got to get to work on policing, militarization, and the story of violence in this society. Because there's too many officers like Derek Chauvin. There's too many officers driving military weapons. There's too many riot formations on our streets. Appreciate you being a part of the podcast. I know this was a heavy one today and real lecture-y. But thanks for tolerating it and for being a part of it. Back on Friday, tomorrow, with astrophysicist Paul Wallace. We talk a little bit of science. And then on Mondays, we do a recap of the news and bring in some newsmakers. On Tuesdays is politics, and on Wednesdays we talk about faith, and Thursdays ideas that we think matter. Thanks for being with us today. If you're already connected to Vote Common Good, thank you. If you've never been over to Vote Common Good, head over there, would you? Get on our email list. We'd love to, remind you what we're doing, and don't miss the donate button when you go over there. If these podcasts mean a lot to you and you're willing to donate $5, $10, $500, $5,000 a month, we'd love to have it. So let us know that you've been around by filling out that email form, and share this all with your friends. Share this with the people that you know, our podcasts and all the work that we do. And our email list is the best way to get a little roundup. We send you a Monday roundup and then a couple other emails during the week. So we'd love to have you feel like you're pursuing the common good with the rest of us, whether it's in our voting, in our civic life, and in the rest of what we're doing. And we will talk to you tomorrow.